Bonjour à tous. Nous avons un quorum.
Good morning. We have quorum.
Bill C30. We've got three witnesses today. Mr. Michael Cleland will lead off, President and Chief Executive Officer of Canadian Gas Association. He'll be followed by, if we could, thank you, invite the media to depart. Mr. Matthew Bramley, Director of Climate Change for the Pembina Institute. And finally, Gordon Lambert, Vice President, Sustainable Development for Suncor Energy, Inc. I just point out to committee members, we have the Procedures and House Affairs Committee meeting right after us at 11, so we want to move along fairly quickly. Since they are the whips and House leaders, we don't want to make our bosses angry. So we'll move along fairly quickly. And for the witnesses, just a reminder, we'll be giving you each about 10 minutes, preferably 10 or less, to make some opening remarks, and then we'll be putting it around to the members of the committee to ask questions. A reminder to all that this is about Bill C30, so we'll try to keep it, we know that people have a lot of things to say, but we'll try to keep it focused as much as we can on Bill C30 in ways that we can make that better. So without further ado, ask Mr. Michael Cleland, President, Chief Executive Officer of the Canadian Gas Association, to make some opening remarks. Mr. Cleland, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I will endeavor to respect your time limitation. Thank you and the committee for the opportunity to appear here with some comments on Bill C30. Just very briefly, the Canadian Gas Association is the association that speaks on behalf of the downstream end of Canada's natural gas system, the delivery end. In essence, we deliver natural gas to almost 6 million Canadian customers, businesses, and residents alike from coast to coast in Canada. Today I will indeed focus mainly on Bill C30, but I wanted to start by just saying a couple of things about how natural gas fits in the system, talk about our record on GHG management, and then Bill C30, and then a couple of other perspectives on, if you will, the other part of the debate that really doesn't come up very much when we talk about industrial emissions. Just on natural gas, the numbers are in the documents that we've left you. I won't go through those except to say that natural gas accounts for a little over a quarter of the energy used by Canadians, and it's growing. It's growing particularly in power generation, particularly in distributed generation applications, and it has potential for growth in transportation, albeit from a very small base. The reason for that is pretty straightforward. Natural gas is, for a variety of reasons, a very preferred form of energy. It's flexible, it's clean, it's reliable, it's in abundant supply, and it can make important contributions both to our air quality objectives and to our climate change objectives. Natural gas should be part of Canada's strategy, an important part of Canada's strategy for dealing with climate change. In terms of my industry's record on greenhouse gases, we're a relatively small contributor in a direct sense from the industry, but we are part of the process. We would be part of any regulatory process or regulatory system that is put in place, and in fact we have made some progress in the reduction of our GHGs from 2000, about 6%, and actually a little bit less than that from 1990. Let me turn to C30. First of all, on target setting in general, CGA strongly supports the idea of a framework that has short, medium, and long-term objectives for targets. We think that sets the kind of long view that's essential, as well as the short view that needs to get us moving. But should it go further? Should it include actual detailed targets in the legislation? I would argue that there are some important reasons for not doing that. With respect to Kyoto per se, we've said before parliamentary committees, and I'll say again, that there is no physical way of achieving Kyoto, and we would argue that building Kyoto targets into Bill C30 is indeed to set it up for failure when Canadians are asking us to focus on possibilities for success. I would argue as well that in any event, legislation is not the place for this type of detail. Legislation should set the framework and the authorities to regulate, and the detail should be incorporated in regulations. More detail at this stage means a less stable framework as we look forward. Moving on with respect to the natural gas distribution sector and the targets that we might set, won't go into the details except to say that we've done a lot of work with Environment Canada. We have the data in hand. we are, in fact, well on the way to understanding how we could comply with any reasonable regulatory framework, and therefore urge you to get on with passing Bill C30 and the government to get on with getting that framework in place. I want to comment on the issue of intensity-based reductions. I know that's controversial. Our point is simply that an intensity-based system allows you to focus on what you can control, not what you can't control, and is simply a management system. An intensity-based system, depending on how big is the numerator and how big is the denominator, can ultimately produce absolute reductions, and we should I think, try to get past that debate, focus on, again, putting a practical management framework in place. With respect to air contaminants, I know that hasn't been the main focus, but it is part of Bill C30, and it's important. We think we need to be moving there as well, but we're not in a position, and I don't think most industries are in a position to move as quickly because we haven't done the homework. We've been doing a lot of homework on greenhouse gases. We need to do a lot more on air emissions. And in any event, air contaminants and local air pollution are more complex issues in some respects. Therefore, we would argue that it is entirely appropriate to include both air contaminants and GHGs in the same legislative framework, but they probably need to move on somewhat different tracks in a regulatory sense. In the meantime, we are getting on with it. We have hired a third party to do an inventory of air contaminants from our industry and expect to be in a position to move on that front reasonably quickly. 2 points on compliance options that I want to emphasize, and I know this is something that's being debated around this table. We would argue that there should be a menu of compliance options, and 2 in particular that we think are important. 1, within a domestic offset system, we should allow for offsets related to utility demand-side management programs, something that we and the electrical industry both do. Since 2000, gas utility efforts have reduced natural gas use by something over 700 million cubic feet. It's the equivalent of about 250,000 households heat and hot water. We can do more on that. With the right incentives, and we think one of the incentives that would help us do more would be to allow demand-side management offsets as one of the suite of compliance options. Another part of the compliance options we would argue in favor of is technology investment fund. This is something that can allow us to invest in the future. It can be structured in a way to give some upside cost protection to industry. And I would only add that it's important that that fund be able to invest in a variety of technologies, including, we would argue, downstream-related technologies. I won't spend a lot of time talking about compliance assessment, monitoring, and reporting, except to say that as you think about Bill C30, think about ways of making that more efficient as well as effective and transparent. And then there are a number of measures in our submission that would allow you to do that. Finally, on equivalency agreements, CGA supports that as a mechanism that allows to avoid overlap and duplication if the provinces want to step up. One last thing, there is a specific issue in Bill C30 as structured that, in effect, would require reporting every time somebody turns on their furnace. The release of a greenhouse gas, including CO2, would need to be reported under the way it's worded at present. I don't think that's the intent. It's a minor thing that is probably something that should be done. Mr. Chairman, wrapping up, let me just say the other side of the equation, the non-industrial side of the equation, about half the energy we use in Canada is used in our communities. We have to come at that differently. It doesn't work in a regulatory framework. There are other things we can do and do more. One of them is to significantly accelerate our energy efficiency and conservation efforts, to take a more systematic approach, building on the good work that's been done over the past decade. We need to do more, though. Building on that, we should include fuel switching as part of energy efficiency and conservation efforts. To put that in perspective, by using natural gas in a direct burn application as opposed to using electricity, you can get about a 50% increase in efficiency over the most efficient standalone electrical generation option. notwithstanding the size of that prize and the opportunities that it affords, a lot of energy efficiency programs across Canada, including in the federal government, don't treat fuel switching as a legitimate mechanism. We think it should be. And finally, technology development. Strongly urge that we make sure we have the programs in place to support new technologies downstream as well as upstream. Downstream, small-scale fuel cells, on-site renewables, combined heat and power, making best use of the gas and electricity grids as they exist in our communities today. We can make a lot of progress. We can make a lot of progress in the next 5 years by doing demonstration of those sorts of technologies. Mr. Chairman, I'm over time. I'm going to leave it at that and back over to you.
Actually, you had 30 more seconds, so that's okay. But thank you for that. And we'll turn now to the Pembina Institute, Matthew Bramley, Director of Climate Change. Mr. Bramley, for 10 minutes, please.
Good morning. Bonjour. I'd like to start by thanking the committee for inviting me to testify. Merci beaucoup de m'avoir invité ici aujourd'hui. Today,
Thank you for your invitation to be here today.
And the Climate Action Network of Canada. And I'd like to elaborate today on one of the recommendations contained in the package of proposed amendments to Bill C30 that was submitted by some 23 Canadian environmental organizations. This is the recommendation that the bill require that regulations provide for a fixed cap on absolute emissions that extends a Kyoto-level target to heavy industry for the 2008-2012 period, and an allowance trading system to facilitate efficient allocation of emissions reductions. This is an extremely important recommendation for us because heavy industry accounts for almost half of Canada's greenhouse gas emissions, and because those emissions have been increasing more rapidly than the national total. I've prepared a 7-page technical document that describes how this recommendation could be implemented, and it's entitled Fair Share, Green Share, a Proposal for Regulating Greenhouse Gases from Canadian Industry. Unfortunately, we were not able to prepare a French version in time for this morning, but we'll make one available in the next day or two. Meanwhile, the English version is available now on the Pembina Institute website and on request. There's a strong consensus in Canada that greenhouse gas emissions from industrial facilities must be regulated. But a critical question remains, and that is how stringent should regulated targets be and how quickly should they be applied. The government has indicated that targets should not actually reduce emissions below current levels until the 2020-2025 period, and that targets should not apply until the end of 2010. We believe this falls very far short of what is needed. I'd like to emphasize 4 key points of context for answering this question of how stringent targets should be and how quickly they should be applied. First, not only does heavy industry account for almost half of Canada's emissions, but the 2 biggest contributors, electricity generation and upstream oil and gas, have increased their emissions by 35 and 58%, respectively, between 1990 and 2004, significantly more than the increase in emissions from individual Canadians. Clearly, this situation is not acceptable. Secondly, meeting Canada's Kyoto target is a legal obligation. This obligation has been a part of international law for 2 years, and we believe the time has long passed since we could have a debate about the target as a take-it-or-leave-it option. The government must focus on meeting our legal obligations, not call them into question. Canadians want their country to be law-abiding. Third, the overwhelming consensus of climate scientists is that cutting greenhouse gas emissions is not just essential, but urgent. To play an adequate role in preventing dangerous climate change, Canada needs to reduce its emissions to 80% below the 1990 level by 2050, as other jurisdictions are now committing to do. And to meet this target, Canada's emissions must fall to around 25% below the 1990 level by 2020. Fourth, the Kyoto Protocol provides mechanisms for taking immediate responsibility for our emissions by investing in emission reductions in poorer countries while we begin the work of implementing deep emission cuts at home. And I'd like to make as clear as I possibly can, this has absolutely nothing to do with so-called hot air credits from Russia. Instead, I'm talking about the Kyoto Protocol's Clean Development Mechanism, under which billions of dollars of investments are being made right now in specific emission reduction projects that have to go through a rigorous, transparent process to show the reductions are genuine. Because greenhouse gases spread all around the world, emission reductions are equally valuable in preventing dangerous climate change in Canada, wherever in the world those reductions take place. So our proposal is to set for the 2008 to 2012 Kyoto compliance period Kyoto-level absolute emission targets at 6% below the 1990 emissions level for each of the electricity generation, upstream oil and gas, and energy-consuming sectors. These targets could be met by combining on-site emission reductions with domestic or international Kyoto-compliant emission reduction credits generated from projects that generate demonstrable reductions beyond business as usual. We also propose a compliance option of payments at $30 a tonne of carbon dioxide equivalent to an independently administered greenhouse gas reduction trust, which would be mandated to reinvest all revenues in domestic offset credits from projects located such that revenues stay in their province of origin. For the post-2012 period, we'd like to see an announcement by government of an intention to gradually tighten targets to reach the vicinity of 25% below the 1990 emissions level by 2020, to limit purchases of international credits as needed such that the market price for domestic credits is at least $30 a tonne of CO2 equivalent, rising to at least $50 a tonne by 2020, and to auction a steadily increasing proportion of allowances. This proposal has been designed to meet 6 key objectives. The most important of these is environmental fairness. The proposal meets this objective by requiring heavy industry as a whole to contribute to achieving Canada's Kyoto obligations in proportion to its share of emissions. Heavy industry accounts for close to half of Canada's emissions and would contribute close to half the reductions needed to meet the target. The proposal also ensures environmental fairness by requiring the most emission reductions relative to business as usual levels from the sectors contributing most to emissions growth post-1990, which is the internationally accepted base year for emission reduction commitments. The proposal also meets the critical objective of economic feasibility because it distinguishes sectors according to their ability to pay. I'd like to take a moment to justify that statement. The proposed targets represent reductions in emissions relative to a business-as-usual projection of approximately 11% for the energy-consuming sectors, 36% for electricity generation, and 46% for upstream oil and gas. I'll discuss each of these in turn. The target for the energy-consuming industries is obviously modest. The proposed emission reduction of 11% relative to business as usual is close to the 12% reduction proposed by the previous government that was broadly accepted by industry. These industries could face difficulty in taking on a more stringent target as they're relatively mobile and exposed to international competition. The electricity generation sector can manage a more stringent target because the need to generate electricity relatively close to the consumer means the sector has little vulnerability to international competition, and in addition, electricity prices in Canada are often regulated. Costs should be reduced by widespread government support for electricity conservation, low-impact renewable energy and cogeneration, helping reduce the quantity of emission reductions that electricity producers would have to pay for themselves. Assuming that such government support existed and that coal phase-out in Ontario proceeded rapidly, the cost to the remaining coal-fired generators would be between about 0.6 and 1.3 cents per kilowatt hour. This can be compared to an average residential price of electricity in Canada of nearly 9 cents per kilowatt hour in 2004. The upstream oil and gas sector also has relatively little vulnerability to international competition because its profit margins are large and because resources such as oil sands cannot be moved to a different country. And even though the proposed emission reduction of 46% relative to business as usual may seem large, it is similar to the 50% reduction that Shell Canada has voluntarily committed to achieve by 2010 for its first oil sands operation. We calculate the cost to an oil sands producer would be only between about 58 cents and $1.16 per barrel in US dollars. This is a small amount compared to recent variations in crude oil prices. The calculations of the costs I've just outlined are very straightforward, and I'd be happy to explain them during questions. I'd also like to add that our proposal also meets 4 other important objectives. It provides environmental integrity by setting targets in terms of actual emissions, not emissions intensity, and ensuring that all options for compliance represent real near-term emission reductions. It provides for urgent domestic action by signalling an emissions price of $30 a tonne, designed to stimulate large-scale development of low-emission technologies such as carbon capture and sequestration. The proposal provides for geographic balance via the guaranteed $30 a tonne domestic compliance option that would provide an alternative to investing in international projects. And last but not least, it provides for certainty. Price certainty for industry by initially limiting the cost of emission reductions to $30 a tonne, quantity certainty in the form of a clear outcome for actual emissions levels, and broader regulatory certainty by including indicative information about targets and prices out to 2020, and by adopting a design that will be robust for the long term. I'd also like to note that although the proposal is applied on a sectoral basis, it would not be very different if it were applied on a territorial basis because of the way the three key sectors are distributed regionally. So in conclusion, requiring that industry assume a fair share of responsibility for cutting greenhouse gas pollution will not only get us nearly halfway to Canada's Kyoto target, it will also put Canada on track to have the world's cleanest oil and gas production, a 21st century electricity system, and eco-efficient manufacturing. We believe this is the vision we need to be aiming for. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Bramley. We'll move on to our third witness from Suncor Energy, Inc., Gordon Lambert, Vice President, Sustainable Development. Just before we start, though, I'll say that the briefs from Suncor and Canadian Gas Association were sent out over the Internet, so everybody should have them. Mr. Lambert, for 10 minutes, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, members of the committee, for this opportunity to present some perspectives of Suncor Energy on the issues of climate change, clean air, and our energy future. I would like to begin by suggesting that we have a need to reframe the dialogue on the issue of climate change. I think over the last decade, one of the key reasons that we've not been able to make the kind of progress that's required on this difficult issue is that it's been a discussion that's centered on equitable allocation of pain. And that's pain between provinces, between sectors of industry, and within Canadian society. Of course, we all know equity is in the eyes of the beholder, and that's a negotiation that we feel is doomed to fail. We think the more powerful platform to discuss these issues from is to focus on opportunities, and those are opportunities to develop new forms of renewable energy, biofuels, new technologies like CO2 capture and sequestration, and energy efficiency improvements in how we use energy across our economy. We also believe an opportunity mindset relates to the setting of midterm and long-term emission goals, and also goals related to technology advancement and development as a key enabler towards energy and environmental sustainability. I would highlight in this regard the recent work by the National Roundtable on the Environment and Economy that looked at what Canada's energy future might look like by 2050. We believe this is a compelling piece of work that needs to be carefully studied as a platform for climate change policy looking forward. However, to create that energy future that's more climate friendly and also contributes to clean air is going to require engagement of capital markets. Private sector capital is the only vehicle that's going to allow for the significant transformational change that's going to be required. We also believe that sustainable development is the right context for approaching these difficult issues. The notion that a strong economy, a healthy environment, and social well-being are interdependent, we believe, still sets the platform for creative solutions as we look at difficult issues. These aspirations are interdependent, and they compel us to think more broadly and creatively about the solutions as we look ahead. I'd like to focus, in addition to this, on some foundational assumptions for sustainable solutions. First and foremost in Canada is that we have had a legacy of abundant and cheap energy that has shaped Canada in a fundamental way. This is the reason Canada is not like Europe in terms of our vehicle fleet, our urban density, the size of our homes, and mass transit. We accept that as Canadians and as a global community, we cannot continue to produce and use energy in the same way as we have done in the past. This is at the heart of our urban air quality issues, climate change, and even quality of life concerns as we continue to expand our urban footprints. But in saying that, we also need to recognize that we are all part of the problem and we all need to be part of the solution. When we look at the issues of climate change and urban air quality, it's not just bad guys and good guys. It's not simply a case of industry being the problem and consumers being viewed as separate from it. You can't separate the supply of energy from the demand for energy by each of us as consumers. Industry, including the oil and gas industry, should be viewed as an essential part of the solution. Where else in society do you find the depth of technical, business, and commercial expertise, and, most importantly, the access to investors than in industry? And we're prepared to be a positive part of that solution. But in order to make the progress we need to make, we have to engage capital markets and private sector investment. There is no amount of government money that's ever going to fund the transformational change that's required towards real sustainable solutions over the long term. And so as we reflect on the target-setting discussions that this committee is deliberating on, I think that the real concern that we have is targets that would erode investor confidence. And that would be unintended consequences that would be unacceptable, I think, for all of us. Now, I'd like to cite a positive example of what engaging capital markets can look like, and I would use wind power as being the example. So in the case of wind power, in the year 2000, Canada was the lowest of any of the OECD countries in installed wind power capacity. But governments collectively declared the public interest and intent that wind power should be part of Canada's energy mix. There was an in-depth analysis by environment NGOs, industry, and government working together to analyze why capital was not flowing to wind development in comparison to other countries. The Wind Power Production Incentive Program and the recently announced Eco Energy Renewables Incentive Program was established and has contributed to substantial growth in this sector. And rather than provinces avoiding an equitable allocation of pain, they're actually competing for investment of wind power. Suncor, with its partners, has now invested $306 million in 147 megawatts of new capacity. And this was not done to comply with an obligation. It was done because the signals were put in place that attracted capital to this segment of the energy sector. An additional example of positive engagement is the recent dialogue on biofuels. Ethanol development was declared as a common objective of provinces and federal governments. Investors have been consulted on required policies and measures. There was a combination of carrots and sticks that have been put in place, including financial incentives, excise tax treatment, and renewable fuel standards. In response to this direction, Suncor has now invested $120 million in a world-scale ethanol plant in Sarnia, Ontario, and we're looking to double capacity of that plant in the near future. We're also testing biodiesel with Toronto Transit Commission in 1,400 buses, and we have more capital expenditures and projects planned across Canada. And I would suggest other segments of industry are looking at biofuels in a similar way as a growth opportunity, and an exciting one at that. Now, as we pursue change through development of this Act, I think it's also important to always keep the end in mind. And we think in that regard, the National Roundtable on the Economy and Environment greenhouse gas reduction study shows where some of these key opportunity areas are. And they include carbon capture, energy intensity improvement of industry, biofuels and alternate fuels, renewable electricity, and many forms of energy conservation. We believe that in order to move that vision forward, that we need to engage expertise that would focus on each of those individual wedges to carefully assess what policies and measures could be put in place that would attract the capital to make that vision happen. In addition, we believe target setting should take the form of outcomes for each of the wedges that have been put forward. And so just like on wind power, where we talk about megawatts of installed capacity by certain points in time, we believe that same approach to target setting could be taken in other areas. And the CO2 benefits of that would then be calculated as part of our progress towards Kyoto compliance. In summary, where do we go from here? We think that we should use the Clean Air Act as an instrument to regulate very defined and targeted industrial energy efficiency and performance outcomes. So our industry sees the requirement for regulated internal energy efficiency targets, but that those should be focused on bending the curve initially as opposed to a hard cap. We believe that we should initiate focused expert panels on the other key opportunity wedges as outlined by the National Roundtable study. These could include areas such as CO2 capture and sequestration and mobilizing investor capital to make those opportunities happen, and explore the full range of policy approaches, incentives, fiscal and regulatory. And let's work to formalize a vision for Canada's energy future that ensures future generations have a healthy environment, a strong economy, and quality of life. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Lambert. We'll start our 7-minute round. Mr. Godfrey for 7, please.
Well, thank you very much, witnesses all. I'd like to begin with Mr. Lambert responding to some of the things Mr. Bramley has said. One of the points Mr. Bramley made in his presentation was, in the context of the oil sands, the actual cost per barrel of meeting our Kyoto targets, and he estimated that to be between 58 cents to $1.16 a barrel. Would you care to comment on that?
Well, as in many forms of analysis, the devil is in the details. I would not be able to respond until I understood more fully the assumptions that were underlying that. I would also premise that access to the Kyoto mechanisms and purchase of international reductions would be absolutely essential as an element of a plan of that type. But of course, the costs of these emission reduction credits through the CDM are quite uncertain going forward. And again, the assumptions that would be at play would be critical.
Do you have any objection to international credit purchase through things like the CDM?
Well, we think that you need as many tools in the toolbox as possible. In fact, we'll need all tools at some stage of the game. But we believe first and foremost is the need to advance new technology opportunities domestically. And it's one of the key reasons that CO2 capture and geological sequestration to us is front and center. We believe Canada could be a global leader in demonstrating how to do this on a material scale. And we have the geology, particularly matching oil sands CO2 emissions with mature conventional oil and gas reservoirs in central Alberta to do something that would be bold and exciting and could be taken elsewhere in the world.
Some people, Mr. Lambert, have suggested that given the rapid rate of expansion of the oil sands, that we ought to be working on developing carbon capture and sequestration before we allow for further expansion. In other words, that ought to be a precondition. In other words, to have established that technology so that the future growth of the oil sands can be in a less carbon-intense fashion. What would your reaction to that be?
The lead times are going to be quite significant to put in place the gas gathering system that's required. We're looking at large-scale collection and gathering systems, and also we're going to need to put in place facilities within our plant operations to treat that CO2 in order to get the kind of quality of CO2 necessary for injection. It's kind of a chicken and egg dilemma. We would only install those CO2 treatment and capture facilities on our sites as part of the growth of that resource.
So I didn't hear you deny the possibility that the carbon capture and sequestration process might accompany, indeed precede, or at least accompany in a parallel fashion, the expansion of the oil sands, rather than having the oil sands expand first, then we try and figure out how to capture the stuff afterwards?
The ideal, in our view, would be a parallel path approach where we were doing both the CO2 capture infrastructure and the development of the resource.
Mr. Bramley pointed out that Shell Canada, for one of its existing plants, has set a voluntary target of a 50% reduction of greenhouse gases by 2010. How applicable is this to other companies or other facilities? In other words, if Shell could do it for at a rate of 50%, why shouldn't others do it at a rate of 46%?
We're keen on understanding what Shell are planning to do to achieve that target. I know they're spending a lot of effort towards meeting that. It will involve significant purchases of reductions internationally. Again, we're not sure exactly what the cost of that could be. Our own preference, quite simply, and you'll see that as a company, has been to invest within Canada in the renewable energy area, and so wind power development, biofuels development, and new technology. And we'd like to see that as the way forward. Although it's not a quick and easy answer, it's more of a long-term approach. We believe that that use of capital is more beneficial for the country longer term.
At what point, with best efforts being applied, I mean real urgency and real incentives and indeed real regulation, do you think that the oil sands specifically could pass from intensity targets to hard caps, understanding that hard caps might be arrived at through a combination of international trading, through some of these other things you're describing like ethanol and wind and all the rest of it? At what point can you imagine us stopping the absolute growth of emissions in the oil sands given all of the oncoming technologies?
I couldn't pin that down to an exact year. I mean, some of this is based on what pace is innovation and technology deployment going to occur during this time frame. I can tell you that the pace of innovation is going to quite simply increase dramatically for many reasons, but reducing the resource intensity of oil sands development is important to the industry. We see that the 2050 kind of long-term objective for bending the curve is something that we think is achievable, and the trajectory that was set out by the government on bending, flattening, and then lowering that trajectory, we think is a good model to adopt.
Okay, we have to move on. Thank you, Monsieur Bigra, pour 7 minutes, s'il vous plaît.
7 minutes, Mr. Bigra. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. First, I'd like to welcome our witnesses here today. A year ago, I was quite impressed by a news item on the Suncor's financial situation. I heard on the news that for the quarter ending March 31, 2006, you announced an increase in sales of $294 million to $1.3 billion a year. And so you had increased your benefits by 10 and the figures went from 700 to $713 billion. So in economic terms, financial terms, things are going well for Suncor. But we would have hoped that in terms of reduction of HGs would be as good as your financial results. My question is this: what was your fear about having a very ambitious target based on greenhouse gas reductions, given that your profits are good, your figures are increasing tenfold? So what was your fear about having targets for reducing greenhouse gases in an ambitious way, given that your financial situation is extremely good when we compare other industrial sectors?
It's not a matter of simply financial capacity. I mean, when you look at our plant operations, we have different vintages of facilities that we operate. Those facilities that have been built in the past, quite simply, aren't as efficient as the new facilities that are being brought on. We can't transform that older vintage equipment overnight. It just doesn't happen that way. But it's important to note that if we had had the same energy intensity today as we did in 1990, we would be emitting more than 40 megatons of greenhouse gases more than we do today. And so we have bent the curve very substantially through just continuous improvement orientation. The next generation of oil sands facilities, though, are going to be substantially more efficient than the current, and we do see technologies coming into play in the very near to medium term that are going to make some significant improvements. And so the money is going to go towards reducing our energy intensity going forward.
I've read some figures from the Chamber of Natural Resources of Alberta, which expected an increase of some 285% in GHGs relative to the production of tar sands. Could you confirm for me that there is an increase in over 200% in GHGs in the oil sands in the next few years? And if that's so, well, I was reading in your brief, and in a number of points on page 2, for instance, page 5, for example, you're boasting that your GHG intensity is less than 25% compared to the 1990 figure. If you are expecting an increase of 225% in GHGs by the tar sands, are you not misleading people by putting forward such figures that are not a real picture of what's going on?
Publicly on an annual basis on our greenhouse gas emissions, and have for many years, actually for more than a decade. Most recently, we just issued our 15th annual greenhouse gas report. And so we're not hiding anything from anyone. Anyone can go and find out what we're doing on this issue. But it is true that as production volumes grow from the oil sands, we're not repealing the laws of physics. Greenhouse gas emissions go up. They go up less than they otherwise would have. And that's a societal choice that we have. You know, we're not the owners of the oil sands resource. The people of Alberta and Canadians are. We want to develop it as well as it can be done, and to do it better over time as well. But the development of the oil sands resource is a choice that Canadians quite simply have, and it doesn't come without environmental consequences. On the flip side, we're heavily regulated, one of the most heavily regulated industries anywhere.
Dans le cadre du marché de carbone, la Bourse de Toronto affirme ce matin, et je cite là, estime que des cibles basées sur la réduction de l'intensité des GES plutôt que sur la réduction absolue comme le stipule le protocole de Kyoto.
Rather than absolute reduction, as stated in the Kyoto Protocol, is not the best approach if we want an effective, efficient market. That's what the Toronto Stock Exchange said yesterday. My question is this. If by promoting intensity reduction of GHGs, you are not compromising the setting in place of a carbon market in Canada by the fact that you are suggesting intensity rules rather than absolute rules. The question is to all of the witnesses.
Short answers, please.
Des réponses courtes, s'il vous plaît.
Well, first of all, I think that question actually was a good illustration of what I was highlighting in my presentation, the difference between a negative orientation versus a positive one. We think that new technologies like CO2 capture are where the real reductions are going to occur long term, and let's have the dialogue about what's necessary to attract the capital needed to make that happen, as opposed to punitive targets that would erode investor confidence and actually undermine our ability to finance the environmental improvements that we're talking about today.
Just on that, I guess two comments. I would say, first of all, there are going to be a lot of impediments to the development of a carbon market in Canada. Canada is way too small to be a carbon market in and of itself. So until we can develop links to the rest of the world, it wouldn't work. There are a number of other impediments that are going to be there, but let's just also be sure that we don't have the tail wagging the dog here. The objective is not to have a carbon market. The objective is to reduce the greenhouse gas intensity and ultimately the greenhouse gases in the economy. The carbon market can be facilitative. The issue is let's get the signals in place that make people's investment decisions move in the right direction. Over time, indeed, a carbon market will likely emerge.
I would just add that there is value in being able to link with other carbon markets. The world's largest carbon market is currently in the European Union, and the European Commission has made clear that there wouldn't be any possibility of Canada being able to link to the European market if we have intensity targets. But I think the biggest problem with intensity targets is that they have a track record, frankly, of abuse by governments. We've seen the intensity targets for greenhouse gases set by the Bush administration and set by the government of Alberta, which have been presented as being representing major steps forward, major emission reductions, whereas in reality they allow emissions to continue to increase. I think we need targets that can be easily understandable by everyone, that are related to the environmental goal, which is emissions, not emissions intensity, and that maximize accountability. If the government wants Canada's emissions to continue to increase, it can still set absolute targets, but at least everyone would be clear exactly what was intended.
Move on to Mr. Cullen for 7 minutes, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and to the witnesses. I would encourage the witnesses to take a look at the testimony that we received last night from 3 of the panelists who presented on the IPCC reports, the latest, I think, condemnation, actually, of the economic model we've driven forward in the last 100 years. The results of the studies, and they're very conservative estimates by these 2,300 climatologists, is that action is needed, and it's needed urgently. And yet when I hear some of the testimony today, it feels as if we have the luxury of time. We can develop carbon sequestration over time. There's estimates of $60 per ton by some within the industry, 30 by some outside of the industry. My question, and Mr. Bramley, you spoke to this just recently. I had an argument with the Premier of Alberta recently because he said that Alberta had been the most aggressive when it came to seizing and controlling emissions of CO2, claiming a 19% energy efficiency improvement. Alberta, over 1990 levels. Alberta's CO2 emissions have gone up nearly 40% while those improvements were being made. How intellectually honest is it to suggest you're being aggressive in reducing emissions when emissions have almost gone up 40%?
Well, we always have to be very careful with the word reduction, because a reduction is always a reduction below something. And the kinds of reductions that are often talked about are reductions only in a very relative sense below some future projection of rapidly increasing emissions. So they very often do not represent reductions in, I would say, the common sense understanding. The Alberta target is an interesting one to pursue for a moment. It is a target to reduce the emissions intensity of the Alberta economy by 50% over the 30 years 1990 to 2020. We calculated that if the Alberta economy continued to grow in the present decade and the next decade at the same rate that it grew in the 1990s, Alberta would meet that target of reducing intensity by 50%, while its actual emissions grew by somewhere between 65 and 85%. So I think that's a pretty clear illustration that we're just not getting to the kinds of destinations that the scientists say we need to get to with that approach. When the Alberta target was announced, the government created the impression in the media coverage that there was following that announcement that somehow this was simply a delay of Kyoto targets, and in fact it was going to be much better than Kyoto, only delayed by 10 years. The reality is obviously very, very different from that. It's an example of the abuse that gets made of intensity targets, and I think just for honesty's sake and for transparency's sake, we have to have targets expressed in terms of actual emissions that everyone can understand.
A question for Mr. Lambert. I think you referred to Kyoto compliance at one point in answering an earlier question. Does your company believe that Canada should honor its Kyoto obligations?
Quite frankly, we try to focus on what we have control over, which is our pursuit of technology, renewable energy, biofuels, really helping to create the energy future that we think is going to be required. And yes, we pay attention to the Kyoto Protocol and the mechanisms, but given the lack of general progress on policy development within Canada, we haven't found it very productive to look to governments for guidance.
Yeah, you've probably been wise up to this point. The question I have is with respect to, you talked about a social, environmental, and economic pyramid almost that you rely on. I spoke to the mayor and council of the regional district of Wood Buffalo and up in Fort McMurray, and they've asked for a moratorium on future expansion. What's currently on the books right now of new investment money going into the oil sands?
I don't have that figure in front of me. I mean, there's been...
Is it tens of millions, hundreds, billions?
Yeah, certainly in the tens of billions of dollars.
Tens of billions.
You know, I think it's important, though, as we reflect on that, you know, what's driving that growth, and it's demand for transportation fuels, full stop. I mean, planes, trains, and automobiles. There are no substitutes currently for hydrocarbon-based transportation fuels. And until we start tackling the demand side of this equation as well, this requirement for oil is going to continue in the world.
Do you believe that in the polluter pays principle, in the sense that we've now identified CO2 emissions as a form of pollution that causes harm? From northwestern British Columbia, we've seen the pine beetle. It's now in your neck of the woods. We've seen the economic and social ramifications of this pollution. Do you believe that cost should be captured by business?
The polluter pays principle, I think, is a very good discussion to have, because I think it's important to define how to draw that circle. And if we draw that circle just solely on the production side of the equation and ignore the demand side of the equation in terms of who the polluters are, we're never going to get the level of engagement in our society that's going to be necessary for the transformational change we're talking about. So, in other words, I'm suggesting that each of us, when we drive our automobiles, if we don't become conscious of the fact that we're contributing to that greenhouse gas emissions, both from our tailpipe and from upstream, that we're going to have a serious problem on our hands.
And question for
could I just finish, too, though, with a reminder? If you look at greenhouse gas emissions from a barrel of oil, 20% are related to its production, 80% are related to its end use.
For Mr. Bramley, I'm confused. You've put out some numbers of what the investment costs would be, like 58 cents to $1.16 a barrel. I'm sure industry will dispute that, but even if it were twice or as much as 5 times what your estimate is, why wouldn't industry make those investments if it's if oil's at 50 to 60 to upwards of $80 a barrel over the last couple of years? Why not invest in that if it's such a marginal cost of the total?
Short answer, please.
Well, the quick answer is that the industry does not face the regulated emission reduction requirement and the consequent price on emissions that would drive it to make those changes. And just to add, there's really no mystery about those dollar numbers I quoted. There is a typical oil sands production is emitting 100 kilograms of CO2 per barrel. You can simply multiply that by a 46% reduction and then multiply it by either something in the range of $15 a ton for international credits or upwards of $30 a ton for carbon capture and storage, and you come very easily to the numbers that I stated. So I don't think there's anything particularly mysterious about those numbers.
Thank you very much. We'll move on to Mr. Warwer for 7 minutes, please.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you to the witnesses for being here today. I appreciate the testimony that has already been provided, and the topic today, what we've done with C30 is broken it up into topics, and the topic today is to focus on large industry, oil and gas, and that's what I want to focus my questioning on, because that's the topic. I find it interesting that we're focusing on the 50% of large industry, oil and gas, and there's been comments made on the other 50%, which is us as consumers, and us as consumers in Canada, in the world, are fueling this hunger, this thirst for this energy, and that's what's fueling the expansion. China has a huge hunger for all this energy. We're a country that is a good country to put an investment in. We have a peaceful country. It's a good place to invest. So I think that's why we see the investment coming to Canada, why the United States is looking at Canada, why the world is looking at Canada. I believe we are number 2 in the world, second to Saudi Arabia as far as natural resources for that good, clean energy. But they are connected, and I think, Mr. Lambert, you alluded to that you've said we all need to do our part. So I, as a consumer, am trying to reduce the amount of energy that I use, and each of us, I'm sure, have that responsibility to try to reduce. But focusing today on how can large industry, oil and gas, actually reduce. I think what Mr. Bramley is saying, make large industry reduce the amount now. Don't let it gradually go in that direction. Make them do it now. I don't want to put words in his mouth. He can clarify in a moment. But there is an urgency. We've heard that. Climate change is happening. So we have to change. We've seen the charts. We've seen the graphs where emissions have gone up like this. Climate change is happening, and we need to meet this target down here. How can capture, sequestration, I think, is where we're hoping your industry will go. And you've made comments about that you want to make, you want an incentive, you want a carrot and a stick. You want, in the past we've used voluntary, we've used MOUs, we've said all industry, all sectors of industry will be part of reducing greenhouse gas emissions. But you've put a warning out there that we've got to be careful that it's not just the stick, that it is a carrot. So you've also said it'll take time to build the infrastructure. You've studied. I've gone up to Fort McMurray. I saw the oil sands. I've read the material from Pembina, and they've been very involved with this. How can we? I guess my question is, in a realistic sense, our plan is to present regulations. We've got notice of intent to regulate. We've got the short term will be intensity based, and the midterm and long term will be real caps. That's the plan. Those short term targets will be announced shortly. Are you concerned that that is too big a stick? I hope not. But Mr. Bramley, maybe you can comment too. Are we on the right plan, right track with C30, or do you feel it's too regulatory?
No, I'd say offhand that it's on the right track in terms of imposing regulated performance obligations on companies that would get us bending the curve towards a stabilization kind of goal in the mid-time period. But I'd say in parallel with that regulated efficiency target would be an urgency to advance on the technology opportunities. And so engaging at the provincial and federal government levels with industry to really get aggressive on making CO2 capture and geological sequestration happen in some form of public-private partnership. I mean, that's what that approach characterized the development of Canada's oil sands in the early days. Certainly it was prior to climate change being on the radar screen, but that was a joint public-private collective effort to get the technology in place to develop the oil sands. Let's do the same thing now on CO2 capture and geological sequestration.
Well, first of all, I have a problem with the emissions trajectory that was laid out in the notice of intent that accompanied the Clean Air Act announcement, because it has a target for 2050 which represents substantial emission reductions. Not, I would add, ones that are sufficient from a perspective of science, but nonetheless substantial emission reductions by 2050. And at the same time, the notice of intent foresees emissions from heavy industry remaining at or above current levels until as late as 2025. And I simply don't see how that 2050 target could be credibly reached if we're delaying, we're kind of backloading the action so far in the second portion of that period. Secondly, I would come back to the very straightforward calculation that I presented today, that the oil sands producers can immediately take responsibility for a Kyoto-level target of emission reductions.
Mr. Bramley, could you answer my question? No, the question is, having capture sequestration, do you see in what time frame do you see that as being realistically in place?
There is already 18 megatons of carbon dioxide being captured and sequestered at a single site in Texas right now. There are over 3,000 miles of mainline CO2 pipeline systems already in existence in the U.S. This is not a technology that is, 15 years down the road. It's a technology that exists, is already being deployed on a large scale. If this is what the industry wants to use to cut its emissions, then that is only going to happen if the industry faces a price on emissions that is upwards of $30 a ton. So that is what the target of the regulatory system will have to be.
But in what kind of time frame do you see that would be in place, that infrastructure would be in place, functioning?
Final short answer, please.
I think that the work to put it in place could begin immediately as soon as the clear expectation of a sufficiently high carbon price is there.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Brown. Holland for 5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you to the witnesses. First to Mr. Bramley. There was a question posed around the effectiveness of C30 that you didn't get a chance to answer. Would it be fair to say at this point that C30 really represents a series of minor amendments to CEPA, and that the work of this committee, in your opinion, might be that we have to make substantive amendments if we're to put forward a real action plan for climate change, dealing with climate change?
Well, I'm certainly troubled by the fact that the federal government does not currently have a comprehensive climate change plan. It has made a series of isolated announcements that do not address all the key sources of emissions in Canada. C30, as it stands, is essentially a set of fairly technical amendments to existing legislation. It's certainly not a climate change plan. By the way, a climate change plan would have to be much more than simply a bill. In fact, we know that the government can act immediately using existing legislation, CEPA, if it wanted to move ahead immediately to put in place regulated greenhouse gas targets. Given there is this opportunity to amend C30 and make it stronger, I see that opportunity essentially as one of turning what is currently a government may legislation into government shall legislation. In other words, to put in some requirements to give increased confidence to Canadians that the federal government will be obliged to put in place some of the elements that would represent that one would expect to find in a credible climate change plan.
You had mentioned and spoken to the ability on oil sands to achieve the Kyoto targets within the Kyoto period by 2012. I'm wondering, because it certainly has been said, I know that your organization has said that the growth in greenhouse gas emissions, that over 50% of it would come from the oil sands on a business-as-usual model. In fact, that if the type of growth that has been contemplated by the government of upwards of, say, 5 times current production of the oil sands by 2015 were to occur, that would be obviously much more severe. Yet the Pembina Institute put out a recommendation of carbon neutrality by 2020, and I'm wondering if you could comment on how that would be achieved.
In the analysis that we published on how that sector could become carbon neutral by 2020, we considered a number of scenarios with different combinations of purchasing offsets, in other words, financing emission reductions elsewhere to offset the industry's emissions, combinations of that with deployment of carbon capture and storage at various different levels. I don't have the exact range of results in front of me, but the sort of middle range of the numbers was in the sort of low single figures of dollars per barrel of oil to achieve that target.
And on the clean development mechanism and international trading of credits, and perhaps we could hear from all the witnesses on this, I seem to get concurrence that a preference is to reduce emissions domestically, but that all options need to be utilized. I'm wondering if you could speak as well to the ability through using the clean development mechanism or other methods of international trading credits to A, promote Canadian technology and utilization of Canadian technology, and B, to assist with perhaps some of our foreign development goals in terms of foreign aid.
Well, perhaps if I could begin quickly. I mean, first and foremost, investing in real emission reductions in developing countries through the CDM is a perfectly legitimate way to take responsibility for emission reductions that are not achievable in the very immediate time frame within Canada. Certainly has a positive benefit on protecting Canada from climate change, because as we understand, emission reductions protect Canada from climate change wherever they take place. There's no doubt that it's an opportunity also to export Canadian technologies. Unfortunately, currently only about 12 projects out of some 500 registered CDM projects have any Canadian involvement. And I think this is a consequence of the lack of sufficient progress towards putting in place regulated targets for industrial emitters in Canada. But I would agree with you as well that we should look at the CDM as a kind of specially targeted form of foreign aid, targeting investments that help Canada's environment and also help developing countries get access to much needed resources to get on a more sustainable development path.
Okay, really briefly from the other two witnesses, please, if you would.
Just to add, I would agree the CDM mechanism is a good idea, and it's an important part of the Kyoto framework, but it's a part. The transaction costs for CDM projects are high, including a lot of senior executive time to actually pull them off. Hopefully that will come down over time. But the other one is that unless the investment is close to your core business, it's hard for a lot of businesses to say that's where we should go. I mean, your core business is your production process, your marketing process. For some businesses, it's a natural. For others, it would be quite a stretch.
Yes, and the dilemma that we have as a company is that the CDM is an important instrument. We do see it as a part of the toolbox, but it's actually an easy way to go forward as opposed to doing the heavy lifting that's required to develop the new technologies that we've been chatting about today. So it's a case of what's the best long-term answer here, which we believe is going to be developing and deploying new technologies and not using CDM as a substitute for that.
To Mr. Jean, but before we do, just remind folks that the topic for today is large industry, oil and gas, not tools. It might be argued that CDM is a tool, so we'll just try to refocus a little bit. So, Mr. Jean, for 5 minutes, please.
On a point of order, if I could, just on that point. it would be a tool used by oil and gas. In this instance, oil and gas was commenting on how they might use that tool to meet the reduction target. So I think it's extremely pertinent, and I was happy to hear from the industry in terms of how they may use it.
Let's just make sure that everything is related one way or the other to large industry, oil and gas. Okay? I'm not going to get an argument with you, Mr. Holland. I'm just, as I've done in the past, trying to keep people focused on the topic of the day, knowing that there's going to be some variance in that, and we've been very lenient on that, and will continue to be. But just a reminder that the primary topic of the day is oil and gas, and CDM can be part of that, but it's just a part of it. Mr. Jean for 5 minutes.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. Now, did Mr. Holland cut into my time at all, or?
You have 5 minutes.
Excellent. I want to ask a couple of questions to Mr. Lambert, but Mr. Lambert, your company Suncor started in northern Alberta in 1965. Is that correct? Somewhere around there?
Yes.
And in fact, we listened to Mr. Bramley say that oil sands can't be moved to another country. We have control of the oil sands, and we can't really move the production to another country. But indeed, oil is internationally traded, and the price is based on a world market. Is that correct?
Yes.
Now, the oil sands cost per barrel, what does that range in today's dollars? What does it cost to produce a barrel of oil today?
Well,
just very quickly.
In the ballpark of $20 to $30 a barrel.
And what does it cost for, let's say, Saudi Arabia is the #1 producer in the world with the #1 reserves, we're #2. What does it cost in Saudi Arabia to produce a barrel of oil?
$2 or $3.
So it's quite a bit more expensive to produce a barrel of oil in Canada.
Yes.
Now, I remember I've been in Fort McMurray almost 40 years now, and I remember a little word that I'm not allowed to say in Alberta, which is the National Energy Program. That was brought in by the Liberal government some time ago. And, of course, what it did to our community and just Alberta's economy generally was, and I just want to talk about it very briefly, 25,000 people in the community at that time. I think my parents were in business, and every private business in the area closed down within probably 4 or 5 years, putting many, many people out of work and bankruptcy. And it was based on something that you talked about, which was investor confidence. And I would just like to ask you, what do you see the most important thing that we could do as a government on policy in relation to what we're doing now on C30? Is it in relation to investor confidence?
That's absolutely fundamental. If we impose a punitive target or a price on carbon that ends up being punitive and shareholders aren't captive, they simply will exit the industry, which then hinders our ability to actually make the changes that we're trying to make. It would definitely be one of those unintended consequences that would undermine progress on environment.
Now, in just the last question on this, but in 1986-87, Dee Parkinson was, I think, your president and CEO. At that time, Suncor actually considered closing its doors because of the profitability or lack thereof. Is that not correct? 1987, yes.
Yeah.
Right. How many employees currently does Suncor have in northern Alberta?
Oh, well, I mean, it depends whether you count full-time and also contract workers. At any point in time on our site, we'll have upwards of 10,000 workers in total.
And do you know the mix of those people, where they're from in Alberta or Canada?
Well, they're from across Canada, from all regions, and even internationally, there are skilled trades workers on site as well.
Are there benefits from sequestration that are over and above the ability just to capture greenhouse gases? For instance, my understanding is sequestration will actually be more efficient than pumping other products such as clean water into the surface for gas recovery. Is that correct?
Yes, there's substantial use of water flooding of conventional oil reservoirs as a way of improving efficiency of extraction. CO2 can be used as a substitute for water flooding, and we can get incremental conventional oil recovery as a result.
Is that looked on as a #1 prospect right now for the energy companies in northern Alberta?
Because there's a revenue stream that's generated through CO2 injection into reservoirs of that type, it does tend to be quite attractive. But if we're trying to maximize CO2 recovery and avoidance of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, we'd also be injecting CO2 into storage reservoirs, which would be primarily depleted gas reservoirs. But of course, there's no revenue stream that accrues as if we store CO2.
So in essence, as gas is being pumped from around the province or even Saskatchewan, as the case may be, the faster the sequestration technology is advanced, the more advantageous it is to the industry as well as to the earth, in essence.
Yes, and we think there's an opportunity for innovation on new uses of CO2 as well that we just haven't really found yet. But that'll happen once we have the CO2 supply available.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Lambert. We'll move on to Monsieur Lucier pour 5 minutes, s'il vous plaît.
Oui, monsieur. Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Cleland, you say in your presentation that natural gas covers 26% of, accounts for 26% of the energy consumption in Canada, and that the percentage is growing. Where do you see that increase in the years ahead? And will natural gas cars be part of that growth trend in the future?
Area of growth is in power generation, and I suspect looking forward in distributed generation, combined heat and power applications. It's growing as a share in other parts of the economy, including residential and commercial, and could grow more, actually displacing electricity. Some growth in vehicles, large heavy-duty vehicles in urban areas with some very good urban air quality benefits, but it's from a very small base.
Dans le domaine de l'auto?
A lot harder. They've tried with fleets, police fleets and things in the past. Original equipment manufacturers have tended to shy away from it. The big opportunities going forward are large vehicles such as buses.
Merci. Monsieur Bramley, vous parlez que vous favorisez.
Mr. Bramley, you say that you're in favor of a carbon bank and the administration of carbon credits should be done territorial. Could you tell us a little bit more what you mean about the way these carbon credits would be distributed territorial? Our idea was to suggest an option to achieve the regulated objectives, which would provide an alternative for those who do not feel comfortable with funding projects abroad, the acquisition of Kyoto credits. So the idea was to provide this option of paying at the rate of $30 a ton into this fund, which would be independent of government and which would reinvest these funds in projects which would result in emission reductions locally within the province where the payments were made. If there were not enough opportunities for reduction in the province in question, there would be a subsidy to enable the polluter to remain within the ceiling of $30 a ton. So this was an attempt to provide this option, which gives some geographic balance for those who are concerned about that matter, while providing a good level of certainty to the industry regarding the price per ton for reaching these objectives. Question. And you don't see any possibility of trading within the provinces, between the provinces? No, quite the opposite. This provincial option is just one of a number of options. It doesn't rule out that possibility. No, not at all. That would be possible elsewhere in the country, elsewhere in the world. Mr. Lambert, in your paper, you talked about the fair distribution of efforts. The idea of polluter pay or of the territorial distribution, would that be part of your philosophy? And what should we think about the famous tax that the Quebec government has just levied on oil companies, a few cents per liter of gas, a tax that has been passed on to consumers? What do you think about that?
Does need to flow through to the end use of the product. I mean, if it's an attempt to try and shift behavior or to change behavior of consumers, a price signal is likely going to be needed.
Et quelle est votre définition de la répartition équitable?
And how would you define a fair distribution of effort?
Because as I mentioned earlier, equitable distribution of effort is in the eyes of the beholder. I think it needs to be an approach, though, that's comprehensive to the production and uses of energy. And the National Roundtable work on Energy 2050, to me, is inclusive of a broad range of interests and opportunities.
Thank you.
I have to move on to Mr. Manning for 5, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and certainly to welcome our guests and thank them for their testimony here today. Recent polling has shown that the Canadians' #1 priority is a clean, healthy environment. But just behind that, or just after that, Canadians want a strong economy. And I guess our job here and as legislators and your job as business is trying to find that medium ground where we can have, I guess, both. The oil sands certainly have received a lot of attention lately, creating immense amount of employment opportunities, but I guess in some corners of the world creating some concerns with the environment. We have had official opposition members threaten to close them down. And of course we had, but then on the other side of that, last January, we had the former government engage in secret meetings with the United States looking to expand the production by 4 to 5 times. So I guess what I'm trying to get at, and maybe I'll pose the question to Mr. Lambert first, is that we're trying to find the common ground here that we can have a healthy environment but also have that strong economy that we need to have in order. I find it difficult to understand how we're going to correct the concerns we have in the environment unless we have a strong economy behind that. And I guess so my question to you is, what do you believe are the keys to creating that environmentally sustainable economy in Canada?
Yes, and just to reinforce, I think we do have a significant dilemma in front of us, where on the one hand we want abundant, cheap energy because we get blasted too for high gasoline prices any time they go up, and we also want a clean environment. To be honest, the only way to close or to square that circle is technology and innovation. So in other words, it can't be the case where we just continue to produce and use energy the same way in the future as we have in the past. And I think you do see those signs of innovation starting to come onto the market. I mean, hybrid vehicles, 10 years ago they were felt to be a dream. Now they really are penetrating the transportation market. On oil sands, I mentioned CO2 capture that we're actively working on. We're also part of a consortium looking at deep geothermal energy. This is dry rock geothermal energy that would actually be emissions-free energy for development of not just the oil sands, but imagine it for central heat and power of our communities. This is drilling at tremendous depths in the order of 5,000 to 7,000 meters. But again, very exciting as an opportunity, and we're aggressive. We want to pursue that. But we're looking for the kinds of policies and partnerships with governments that are going to help encourage the investment that's needed to get there. And it's not going to be done through punitive regulation and hitting us over the head harder. That's not going to be the motivator. It's got to be a collaborative effort, a joint effort, and one where we really do roll up the sleeves to make this happen.
Yeah. Mr. Lennox?
Maybe can I just add to that? I mean, you talked about two things Canadians are looking for from their energy system. One is they want it to be affordable, or maybe cheap, but at least affordable. They also want it to be environmentally sustainable. The other thing they want is they want it to be reliable. They want it to meet their needs all the time in the middle of a cold winter or whenever that happens to be. The right conditions for keeping those three things on the screen is policy that provides a steady push in the right direction. Sharp inflections, shocks, things that upset the environment, the investment environment, or things that frankly push technology into the environment faster than we can learn about how to apply them are bad policy. We need to act. Mr. Cullen talked about acting urgently. Agree. We need to get going and get that price signal flowing through to investors and consumers.
Did you want Mr. Manley to put it?
Yeah, well, I just think it really stretches credibility to suggest that an additional cost to oil sands producers on the order of $1 a barrel would be in any way punitive or somehow getting us away from a balance between environment and economy. We heard from Gord Lambert that the production cost is $20 to $30 a barrel. I'm not sure what the price is currently, but I think it's been in the 50s and 60s recently. Clearly, there are enormous profit margins in this industry, and it's very difficult to see why $1 a barrel would be a dramatic shock to anyone.
Okay, we'll move on to Mr. McGinty for 5, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you very much for witnesses. I'd like to go right to the question that I think is probably on the minds mostly of the oil and gas and energy sector in this country, which is how much is it going to cost to comply? And I'd like to go back to 2 questions I put to our Minister of the Environment in this committee maybe 10 days ago. And I asked the Minister directly whether he had any idea what the size of the international carbon market would look like, and he could not answer, would not answer. And then I asked him directly whether we'd be participating in an international carbon market. And his answer was, we're not looking at participating in an international carbon market. And I said, can you repeat that for the record? And he said, we're not interested in participating in carbon markets overseas. Now, today we learned that on December 21st, the President of the Toronto Stock Exchange sent a letter to the Minister and the Prime Minister advising both that the cost of compliance for Canadian companies would be excessively high if we were to have a mere domestic market. The document goes on to say Canadian companies would be disadvantaged with a domestic market only because the cost for each ton of greenhouse gases would be excessively high, especially because of the small size of the Canadian market. Similar remarks have been made by Clive Mather, the President and CEO of Shell Canada, who is asking Canada to remain a signatory and a full participant in Kyoto and to participate in the international carbon markets that it's creating. Now, can we hear from all 3 witnesses on what will be the effect if Canadian oil and gas companies, energy companies, cannot participate in the burgeoning European market, the startup markets in roughly 18 or 20 American states, and do you believe that it is an intelligent thing for this country to do to shut down our eventual and potential participation in international carbon markets when we know that the cost of compliance for the energy sector in this country is going to be higher? Whereas other countries who are signed on and are participating, including potentially the United States, their companies are going to benefit from lower costs in terms of compliance. Is that an intelligent thing for us to do at this stage, given what we know about the burgeoning international carbon markets?
I'd like to reiterate a comment I made earlier in my remarks about needing all the tools in the tool basket. How hard we use them, or how aggressively we use each one of these tools is going to be something we're have to be quite careful about, though. So again, we don't think any doors should be closed. We do support, though, and I want to reinforce, based on the technology theme that I've been stressing this morning, the possibility of establishing a technology fund as an additional compliance mechanism for Canadian companies as part of our regulatory approach. And so the Canadian Association of Petroleum Producers has been advocating for a technology fund as a compliance mechanism where companies could pay into that fund and have those funds used to support deployment and advancement of new technologies domestically.
McGinty, just a couple of things on that. I won't comment on Mr. Baird's comments and or what the import was of them. I guess I would say, in the first instance, all of the things being equal, we should be looking in the first to how do we reduce our own domestic emissions. We have to change the structure of the underlying capital in the economy. So all of the things being equal, that should be where we want to go. But we also need a suite of other compliance options. Exactly consistent with Mr. Lambert's comment, we need as complete a basket of compliance options as possible.
Mr. Cleland, I have to interrupt you because my time is really short. I just want to know, what is the position of your sector now with respect to a mere premier and single Canadian domestic emissions trading market, which is not ultimately fungible and connected to the international markets? Is this going to help your oil and gas and energy sector reduce the cost of compliance by reducing GHGs using an international trading system?
We would want to have access to as complete a set of options as possible, including clean development mechanism, including other markets as they develop in parallel with the...
It would be beneficial to Canadian industry to participate in a fully fledged international carbon market. Is that how I understand?
It's beneficial to Canadian industry to have the most cost-effective ways available of reducing emissions, which might include that option.
Okay. Our time is up at 5. We have
Mr. Bramley,
Mr. Parity. Well, Mr. Bramley, you've got 15 seconds.
Well, very quickly then, and clearly the motivation for emissions trading is first and foremost cost reduction. I'm troubled that when the government rules out the use of the international carbon market, it makes achieving our international obligations much harder than they really
your time is now up. Mr. Warren, a point of order.
I didn't interrupt when Mr. McGeety made a statement, but it was, I believe, misleading. And so now that in response, Mr. Brownlee is repeating a statement which I believe is incorrect. The minister did not say we will not permit international carbon trading market. He made it very clear that Canada will not send billions of dollars overseas. He would not use taxpayers' dollars. So if the question is, do you support or would it help industry to be involved with an international market, that would be fine. But to make a statement, Mr. Speaker, Mr. Chair, that the government will not, that's an incorrect statement. I just want to clarify that.
I think it's a matter of debate, and I don't want to get bogged down in matters of debate like that. Now we are going to move on to Mr. Parity for 5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The question was raised earlier. We know the way energy is used here in Canada with their background, with lower prices. Wasn't necessarily the most intelligent way or the most efficient way of proceeding. We can think of diesel fuel to heat our homes, or industrial use of natural gas in the tar sands. So my first question is to Mr. Cleland. What role do you see for the federal government in that to ensure that the right fuel is being used in the right place? And will the proposed regulations under the Clean Air Act encourage efficient energy use? And perhaps to illustrate this, I don't have a great deal of time. That's why I'm asking all my questions at once. Could you explain the Clean Air and Communities proposal? What sort of project might come out of such a plan?
If I can, I'll answer the question in 2 parts. First of all, the regulations that might arise under Bill C30 or the Clean Air Act when it's passed. By rights, if they create a signal to investors to invest in greenhouse gas reductions, as long as it's even-handed in its application, will tend to make people make the right choices. So that's one step. My point earlier on, and thank you for the question on that, was that the other half of the equation, the other 50%, is something that doesn't lend itself to treatment under direct regulation of that sort. So we've put some ideas forward that essentially involve having the federal government, in cooperation with the provinces and industry, contributing to investment in local energy technologies such as combined heat and power systems, hybrid systems involving on-site renewables and energy efficiency to get at the other 50% of the equation. Again, what's important there is that there is a level playing field among fuels to make sure we do use the right fuel in the right place.
Okay.
Earlier, this point was raised. My question this time is to Mr. Lambert. From your point of view, how can we go about ensuring that the government's current exercise can make a positive contribution in changing the economy and not simply forcing people to achieve targets in the short term? because you said earlier if we had targets that are not achievable, that could undermine public confidence. However, there is an urgency. We have to transform our economy. So I'd like to hear industry's view on that. Could you comment from your point of view, please?
This is where I think the National Roundtable work on the wedge model, as it's come to be known as, could be very valuable. Because I think what we could do is engage subject matter experts in each of those individual wedge areas and explore in detail what the barriers are to implement and make progress in each one of them. And let's use wind power as the good model that we could then use in other areas. That was a dialogue between governments, the private sector, and NGOs about what was necessary to accelerate wind power development in Canada. We did get the policy signals right. It did start to move, and we started to go forward. Let's take that and apply it to each of the other areas that we've been talking about today.
Would other witnesses care to comment?
Gord Lambert said earlier, which is that what we need to do here to move towards deep reductions in emissions is to mobilize private capital to achieve a transformation in the economy. And to do that, we need to set regulated requirements to reduce emissions at a sufficiently stringent level that the price on emissions drives a major change in investment decisions. And that must be the test for whatever it is that is included in the Clean Air Act or in the government's broader climate change plan.
Mr. Cleveland? Could I just come back to the point? I mean, I think it is the fundamental question is what do we do to create that transformation in the economy? But again, I would emphasize that 50% or more of the energy we use is used in Canadian cities and communities. That's our houses, it's our buildings, it's the underlying infrastructure. The kinds of changes we're talking about by 2050, call it 50, 60, 80% reductions of greenhouse gases in absolute terms. It won't work if we only do it on industry. We have to restructure our Canadian communities over the next 50 years, and that's got to be part of the puzzle.
We'll move on to Mr. Scarpaleggia for 5 minutes, please.
Thank you, and I didn't even ask. You know, you came to me naturally, I guess, which is good. Thank you. What I hear from a lot of business witnesses is, well, we have to keep talking, we have to keep talking, we have to keep talking with the government and other stakeholders. I never hear, this is what we can live with, this is our bottom line, or even, this is our opening bid, and we're open to negotiation. It seems to me that the previous government held consultations with industry, with both your industries. So I get the sense that we're into avoidance. We're into avoidance. But my question is to you, Mr. Lambert. The original projections for oil sands development, have been exceeded, have they not, by a great figure? For example, what would the prediction have been for annual oil sands production back in 1998, or thereabouts? Say the year 2000. What would it have been per day, barrels per day?
Whose prediction?
Doesn't matter. Take an average, or the one you accept. It doesn't really matter.
Well, I mean, we could use the National Oil Sands Task Force in the mid-90s estimated 1 million barrels a day by 2020.
And what are we headed for now by 2020?
Well, we were at 1 million barrels a day in 2005.
What are we headed for in 2020?
I mean, whose crystal ball is
double?
Is the right one. Well, certainly there's been announced plans that would put us in that range.
So when the government ratified Kyoto, it was looking at a certain prediction for oil sands production, and we're going way above that by now, I would think.
Yeah, well, ratification of Kyoto happened in
2002.
Yes.
My next question is this: do you see the price of oil going up sort of significantly in the future, or do you see it going down? Do you see the oil sands at all at all at risk of having to slow down their development because of dropping petroleum prices?
I can predict with 100% certainty that I can't predict the price of oil. It's in fact not, we don't even...
Well, with growing demand worldwide that is skyrocketing, that we hear about every day, and as you said at the very beginning of your testimony, you know, there are no real alternatives right now, that we're wedded to oil, and that we have China coming on stream, we have India. Do you see the price softening?
Well, we sure don't see demand globally softening.
Okay, that's fine.
What we don't have a clear picture of is the supply side of the equation. I would say that oil sands strategically in the world is a critically important resource.
Critically important resource in a tight market. And what's your sort of marginal profit on a barrel of oil sands oil?
Well, I mentioned previously in terms of cash costs per barrel, we're in the $20 to $30 range.
And how much are you selling it for?
Capital costs, I should also say, though, are under very severe upward pressure right now, which is the other limitation to how aggressively that resource could be developed.
You know, I just hear that, you know, that everything's going well, the market's strong, you know, our profits are good. But just leave us alone. That's the message I hear from a lot of industry sectors, and especially from the oil industry. It's like we can't do anything unless we are giving you money to develop technology.
We just completed the largest ethanol production facility in Canada and commissioned it in June this past year. We're currently building our 4th wind farm. As Suncor Energy, and that's who I'm here today to represent, we are creating Canada's energy future, and not just in the hydrocarbon energy realm, and it's investing real money and creating jobs and opportunities for Canadians across Canada.
Now, Shell said it can reduce its emissions by 50% by, what was the year again? 2010. And that it's prepared to buy some credits to do that. Why can't Suncor do that?
We have a climate change plan, but our focus primarily is first and foremost our internal energy efficiency. Second is renewable energy investments, which we are making in Canada as an alternative to purchasing credits, and then new technologies, which includes the CO2 capture and geological sequestration. We're working with a consortium. And this is tough, hard work, right? I mean, the engineering designs of these projects or these opportunities have tremendous complexities to them. And I mentioned also deep geothermal. I mean, we're not standing still or playing defense on this issue at all.
Okay, thank you. We'll move on to Mr. Watson for 5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Lambert, you talk about new technologies being a key part of moving forward on deep domestic reductions. Now, some have suggested around this table over the course of our hearings that the Kyoto target and timelines be enshrined in C30 as the short-term target, and I want to sort of focus on that scenario in the short term. Can carbon sequestration be widely applied and immediately deployed in your sector to achieve measurable reductions in order to meet that type of a target in the short-term window?
Well, I cite the National Roundtable study as showing carbon capture and sequestration being one of the largest opportunities that Canada has for material reductions.
So in the next 4 years, that could be widely applied for measurable reductions?
Well, I think the question came up earlier on time frame. You know, we look probably at more like a decade to have that fully up and functional, and different sources being tied in over time.
So more like a decade. Okay, fair enough. The clean development mechanism you've said is, I quote you here, you said the easy way to comply. That would be a lower cost option than putting in carbon sequestration, for example, in the short-term window?
Yes, and I think it's important as we talk about emissions markets to understand what it is they don't do, and that is that they don't provide, they are not a substitute for foresight. They are an easy to use instrument, but with the technologies we're talking about, you require longer lead times, and you're not going to make these investments based on the short-term price of CO2 in a market. These have to be taken as a public-private imperative, and we have to really look at them from that point of view.
So if the Kyoto target's 4 years and carbon sequestration would require 10 years, would the industry be more likely to go for carbon sequestration or for credits?
Well,
Mr. Cleland, you may want to jump in on that.
Yeah, if we get into a punitive mode, we'll be pushed into a box where least cost compliance is going to be success. And least cost compliance is not going to be the mindset that's necessary for the long-term solutions we're talking about today.
I guess the only comment I would add is that time frame is critical, and in a very short time frame, in the next 4 to 5 years, most industry, the only option is some sort of offset or some sort of external credit, because you can't make the physical reduction.
Would you be concerned in that scenario with the capital outflow in the short term when Canada should be investing in the long-term reductions?
If it's moderate, if it's sending an early signal now to get going, then that's probably a good thing, and we do need to get on with it. If it's forever, what we need to do is make sure we're investing in domestic reduction. So it's a question of proportion.
Okay. A question for all the panelists here: should short and medium term targets be negotiated with industry or assigned to industry? Mr. Bramley, you want to start?
Well, I think as someone mentioned earlier, there have been literally years of consultations with industry on greenhouse gas targets.
Fair enough. But
many studies have been done on cost of different levels of targets. I think the time has come to draw all the information together and set some targets, and as Mike Cleland says, get on with it.
2 steps. There needs to be a discussion with industry to make sure we understand what the numbers are and what's practical and what's realistic. A negotiation is a negotiation. At the end of the day, government is the regulator. Government needs to call it and say, let's move on.
Comment, Mr. Lambert? No?
Yes, I think there should be sufficient dialogue to ensure the targets establish creative tension, not to erode investor confidence. But having that understanding, I agree we should move on and set targets for internal energy efficiency that are going to ensure improvement.
Fair enough. That's everything, Mr. Chair. Thanks.
Okay, thank you very much. Now, just before I dismiss the witnesses, we do have one other item to discuss for the committee, so if you could stay behind. But I do want to thank the witnesses, Mr. Bramley, Mr. Cleland, Mr. Lambert. I think it was a good discussion, some good points on various sides, so thank you very much for coming and sharing it with us. And for the committee, we need to talk about the forest products folks who had said initially that they could not come on the day because they wanted the CEO only. We've got them now, and I actually get the clerk to chat about that because he's got the better information.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Excuse me 1 second.
Could we have a couple of you guys here?
Yeah. We got people taking pictures.
Members of the committee, if you could come back for a second, Mr. Warwa.
Meeting's not over.
Mr. Jean, Mr. Manning, Mr. Parity, Mr. McGinty. Anybody else? Okay, we'll start this bit of a discussion again. The clerk will just bring us up to speed on the latest developments with the forest products folks who can now come, I believe.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I was in contact in initial conversations with the Forest Products Association. We invited them to appear on Thursday the 22nd. They informed me at that time that they wanted to have the CEO or Avram Lazar here or nothing, essentially, is the way they put it. There was some discussion at the subcommittee about this, and it was decided that we would continue on with the 4 witnesses that had already confirmed. Since that time, yesterday, I received a call from them again saying that they would make themselves available on the 22nd, not the CEO, but someone else, but that if the committee would want to invite them on another day, they brought up the 27th, which is on CO2 capture, that the CEO would then make himself available for that day. So that's the situation.
So I guess the question then is, do we want them on the 22nd with somebody other than the CEO, or the what did you say, the 27th?
27th.
Or the 27th with the CEO in the morning. Mr. Cullen?
Yeah, I don't particularly mind whether it's the CEO or someone they feel can speak, but having them in at either time will work. It doesn't matter.
Any strong feelings, Mr. Godfrey?
Well, I think I'd like to hear from the CEO if we can fit him in to the date that works for him.
So the 27th in the morning, right now we have 3, so he would be 4. Do we have any problems with that on the government side? Okay. So we'll invite Mr. Lazar for the 27th in the morning. Okay. This meeting is adjourned. Thank you.